Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today let's talk about Canon. It's a fun Friday. I want to talk about it, talk about different things, how I use it here, a lot of comments that I get about it. And also, yeah, I see some boxes in the background. Don't worry about that. That's not what I'm talking about today. Just some boxes, some empty shelves. Let's move on. So, a lot of talking about Canon on my channel. And that's what I want to talk about. Like, what is it? Who gets to decide it? What happens when people disagree? Wow, I see a lot of discussion of this. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to define some terms, see where it gets us. So let's start with IP, which is intellectual property. And I know I say IP on this channel a lot. I'm using it as IP means an artistic work, a book, a painting, a TV show, a video game. The legal definition, which is used in courts, is anything that can be patented, copyright, trademarked, or used as a trade secret, like the recipe for Coca-Cola or Kentucky Fried Chicken. I kind of want some chicken. Anyway, you may not disagree, or you may not agree on this definition. You may disagree on whether or not a mental creation can be owned. Not the point of this video. I just want to define some things so that when I talk about them, people know what I'm talking about. If you want to argue whether that's something you view as valid or not, whole different discussion. Because I want to talk about what's canon for a game, and you have to define it as, that's what I mean as canon for a game's IP. So now let's talk about canon. I define canon for an IP as whatever the owner of the IP says it is. Really simple, because they say something, that's canon. So that way the canon for anything from Fallout to Star Wars to Peanuts characters are definable. It's what the owner of the IP says it is. For the first Fallout, that was Interplay. Now it's Bethesda. So if the owner, for example, says that Harold is a ghoul, he's a ghoul. If they say he's a mutant, he's a mutant. If they say he's both, then he's both. If they say he's neither, okay, he's not either. He's something else. That's what canon is. It was never me. I'm not canon. And the team wasn't canon. Because even though there's a lot of correlation between what we thought was true when we made it and what is canon, that correlation is not 100%. And that's how you can see what the difference is. And now I know many of you are immediately going, no, Tim, no, death of the author. We players define canon. I do not understand this. And I've looked it up. I've seen how it's used on literary works and how you have to understand the author's intent and also society at the time and what people interpreted and what meaning they brought to the work. I get it. But in terms of what I'm talking about here, you can't say game players define canon because you have no consensus. You all don't agree on what canon is. So that means for any particular game, you're going to have hundreds, thousands, millions of canons. And while you may think that's great and wonderful and that's your truth, I don't see how that helps us, having millions of different canons. And then, of course, some people go, no, Tim, the community agrees on a lot of things. I don't believe you. But let's assume that's true. Let's assume that you're going to say, okay, when the majority of players think something is canon, it's canon. Well, if you're fond of Googling death of the author, you might want to Google tyranny of the majority, because I don't really think you want to have canon defined by the majority. Because also, are you sure it's the majority of players feel that way? Because what it probably is the loudest people on the internet, the most frequent posters on the internet, and also some of the most entitled people on the internet. These are people who are online a lot. That's probably what you're hearing, and that could very well be a minority. So, yeah, all this definition of canon being the majority of what game players think in a game is what the canon is, I don't buy that. What I think that is interpretation. So let's talk about interpretation. Interpretation is whatever you think the game means, what you got out of it. The best part of interpretation is you can't be wrong. No one can tell you that's not what you got out of the game. No one can tell you that you thought Harold was a ghoul. Maybe you played Fallout and you thought Harold was a ghoul. Because the cool thing about this is you can, and almost certainly will, differ from other people. But that's okay because it's your interpretation. If someone else thinks Harold's a mutant, okay. Maybe I think he's a kind of a weird thing that's neither, but some people may think he's a weird thing that's both. That's okay. Guess what? Those are your interpretations. Interpretations are fun. You can discuss interpretations, debate interpretations, argue interpretations, but you have to bear in mind that games frequently present contradictory evidence inside of the game. There may be evidence that seems to contradict other evidence. There may be evidence that's super vague. There may be NPCs that outright lie to the player because they have an agenda and they want you to believe something. So you can't go back to the game and go, well, this log entry said this, or this non-player character told me this, because that may not be true, even in the context of the game. So, of course, interpretations differ. I think that's the fun thing of interpretations. I love hearing gamers' interpretations of my games. But guess what? There's one more thing. Intent. Somewhere between canon and interpretation is intent. Intent is whatever the author thought was true. In game terms, it's whatever the developer or the game developers who actually made the content thought was true when they made the content. So when we made Harold and we weren't sure if he was a ghoul or a mutant, we just thought he was this weird ghoul looking thing that may be a mutant and there's a plant growing out of his head. That's our interpretation. It may not be canon because I don't own Fallout. Nobody on the team owns Fallout. And it also may not match your interpretation of what Harold is. You may think, oh no, it's a perfectly given that Harold's a ghoul. It's perfectly given that Harold's a mutant. It's perfectly given that he's both or neither. That's your interpretation. The cool part about this is no one can really argue what my intent was when I put content in the game or the intent of anybody on the team. We may not even agree with each other, but we know what our intent was when we created the content. That's what I love about intent. Intent doesn't have to be canon and it doesn't have to be interpretation. It's just what we thought was true. And I love what intent is special to me because frequently it aligns with canon and many times also with player interpretation, but it doesn't have to. My intent is my intent. You can't tell me what my intent was. And even the people who own the IP can't tell me what my intent was. It is what it is. The same way your interpretation is what it is. And the thing you don't want to accept is canon is what it is. If the people who own it say Harold's a ghoul, then he's a ghoul. I still think he's a weird thing that's neither. But you may think he's a mutant. And we can all be right because that's the difference between canon, intent, and interpretation. And just to underline this, intent can only come from the actual creator, not the IP owners. No, I would not go to an IP owner to ask what the intent was of content. I would want to know from the person who added the content. And that I also don't want to know from the players because that's their interpretation. So I like to talk with other developers because I love to hear their intent. I could care less about legality of canon, and I don't want to know what the majority of players thought. I can find that out online. But when I talk to developers, a common thing I ask them is, when you did this in the game, what was your intent? And intent can range from a system mechanic to a story point to even art style. Although I rarely ever ask art style intent because colorblind programmer. Bottom line, intent might and often does differ from canon and interpretation, and that's okay. So what am I saying here? When I see people argue what's canon, what I instead see is people discussing their interpretation of the game. And if it's my game, I'm quite content with my intent.